In the fall of 1878, a farmer in western Arkansas, while plowing a dry creek bed, struck something hard with the tip of his blade. He assumed it was a root. Instead, it was a rifle, a Sharps carbine, military issue, its stock blackened by old fire, its barrel warped from heat, and wrapped in the rotted remains of a cotton sack. Along the inner seam of that sack, stitched in rust-colored thread, were 11 names. 9 of those names had already turned up on federal death warrants filed at the courthouse in Fort Smith, just across the state line. The other 2 had disappeared entirely from every census, every tax roll, and every church ledger in the Indian Territory, as if the earth had opened and closed over them without a word. That same afternoon, the farmer carried the rifle and the sack into town and laid them both on the desk of the federal marshal. Within 48 hours, the rifle was gone. So was the farmer's written statement. And the name written at the very bottom of the cotton sack, underlined 3 times in that same rust-colored thread, vanished along with them. For nearly a century, no serious historian would admit that the name belonged to a woman. And when the truth finally surfaced, buried in the private letters of a court clerk that a descendant opened in 1962, it carried a detail so disturbing that the Arkansas Historical Society, after 2 closed-door meetings and a formal vote, chose not to publish it. The file remains sealed to this day. Before we continue with the story of the woman the Choctaw Rhodes came to call Nani, which means sparrow, the only bounty hunter on the American frontier whose very name made outlaws bury their weapons in the dirt and flee toward the Mexican border, do me a small favor. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any of these forgotten stories. And in the comments, let me know what state, what country, or what city you're listening from right now. I am always amazed at how far these stories travel, and I read every single comment. To understand what this woman did, and why the records of it are so deliberately broken, you first have to understand the country in which she did it. In the years after the Civil War, the land between the Arkansas River and the Red River was not a state. In any meaningful legal sense, it was not America at all. It was the Indian Territory, a vast, unorganized stretch of country covering what is now the eastern half of Oklahoma, set aside by treaty for the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations after the forced removals of the 1830s. Because it was not a state, state law did not reach into it. And because the tribal courts held jurisdiction only over their own citizens, any man or woman who was not a tribal member and not a federal soldier could commit murder in broad daylight on a creek road at noon and walk away untouched by any sheriff. Every outlaw, deserter, horse thief, counterfeiter, bigamist, arsonist, and runaway killer east of the Rocky Mountains knew this. They had known it since the end of the war. By 1870, the territory had become the largest sanctuary for fugitives on the North American continent, roughly 70,000 square miles, with a white criminal population estimated by the Federal Marshal's Office at more than 20,000 men. The only law that followed these men in was the United States Marshal Service, riding out of the federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, under a hanging judge named Isaac Parker. Over the course of his 21-year career on the bench, Parker would sign the execution warrants of 79 men and preside over the trials of more than 13,000 cases. To enforce Parker's warrants across the territory, the marshals relied on a strange class of contracted riders called deputy marshals, about 200 of them at any given time. Beneath them was a rougher class still, freelance bounty hunters, paid per living body delivered to the Fort Smith jail, and per corpse delivered with verifiable identification matching the warrant. The pay was $2 for an arrest, plus 10 cents a mile, plus a share of whatever reward the fugitive's specific warrant happened to carry. Most bounty hunters in the territory were ex-Confederate cavalrymen down on their luck, Chickasaw freedmen who knew the backcountry, Cherokee veterans of the Union Indian Home Guard still young enough to ride hard, or former outlaws who had cut deals with Parker's court to hunt their old partners for money. The average bounty hunter in that period lasted about 4 seasons before being killed or crippled. Almost none survived a full decade, and almost every single one of them was a man. The woman the Choctaw Rhodes came to call Nani did not fit a single one of those categories. She had been born into slavery in the Mississippi bottomlands around the year 1840. She escaped in the autumn of 1864, while Sherman's army was cutting through Georgia 600 miles to the east. She crossed the Mississippi River on a stolen flatboat in the winter of her freedom. And by the spring of 1869, she was living alone in a one-room cabin on the border between the Choctaw Nation and the state of Arkansas, keeping a Sharps carbine across her knees, a pair of Remington Army revolvers in a flour sack beside her bed, and a leather cord around her neck strung with 7 small bone beads. How she got from a cotton field in Yazoo County to the cabin on that border, and what she did once she arrived, is the question this story attempts to answer. It is not a pleasant question, and the answer, as far as the records we still have allow us to reconstruct it, is not a pleasant answer. Her name on the Carrick Plantation ledger was Hester. No surname was recorded, because none of the Carrick people were given surnames in the plantation books. The plantation itself lay along a stretch of Yazoo River bottomland, about a day's ride northwest of the city of Vicksburg, and was owned by a family named Carrick. By the census year of 1860, the patriarch, Thomas Carrick, had brought the number of human beings he held in bondage to 163. Hester was 13 when she first appeared in the Carrick inventories as a field hand priced at $400. And she was 24 when those inventories stopped being kept, in the summer of 1864. They stopped because, by that summer, Thomas Carrick himself had fled south to Alabama with his 2 unmarried daughters, a wagon of silver, and the plantation Bible, leaving behind an overseer named Abner Gossett with full effective command of the property and the 156 human beings still on it. Abner Gossett was the kind of man whose reputation does not survive in the polite histories written by his grandchildren, but does survive vividly, and in terrible detail, in the Works Progress Administration slave narratives collected by the Federal Writers Project in the 1930s. 3 different former Carrick people, interviewed independently in 3 different states over the course of 2 years, described Gossett in nearly identical terms. He was a small man, no more than 5'6", with pale red hair thinning on top, pale red eyelashes, skin that burned easily in the sun, and a habit of smiling, a quiet, almost patient smile, when he gave the orders that would cause suffering. He kept a pack of 6 dogs trained from puppies to catch runaways, and he had taught the lead dog to hold a grown man at the throat without closing its jaws. He kept a leather-handled braided whip, which he had named, without any apparent sense of blasphemy, *the preacher*, and which he used with what one of the interviewed women called a terrible patient steadiness, as if reading a sermon out loud 1 verse at a time. He also kept a ledger of his own, separate from the plantation books, in which he recorded the punishments he had administered and the names of those who had been, in his own particular phrase, corrected. Hester's name appeared in that ledger more than any other. We know this not from the ledger itself, which was burned sometime in 1865, but from the testimony of a woman named Roa Green, Hester's half-sister by their shared mother. In the spring of 1937, at the age of 91, Roa sat on the back porch of her granddaughter's house in Memphis, Tennessee, and talked for 4 hours into the microphone of a WPA interviewer named Lemuel Krause. The interviewer's typed transcript, now held in the Library of Congress, runs to 47 pages. 41 of those pages are about Abner Gossett. The other 6 are about what Hester did on the night she left. It was the 2nd week of September 1864. The cotton was in. The war was 16 months from its end, though no one on the Yazoo River knew that yet. That afternoon, Gossett had ordered 3 men flogged publicly in the yard for the theft of corn from the corn crib. By nightfall, the 3 men had been locked inside the crib itself, a stone-walled, windowless building with a single heavy door, with no water and no treatment of any kind for the wounds on their backs. One of the 3 was Hester's younger brother, a young man of about 19 whose given name in the plantation ledger is recorded only as Cass. According to Roa Green, the moon that night was near full, but heavy cloud cover was moving in from the southwest. Hester waited without speaking, without eating her supper, without lying down on her pallet, until the cloud bank finally crossed the face of the moon a little before 2 in the morning. Then she stood up. She took off her shoes because they made sound on the boards. She walked barefoot, carrying nothing in her hands, across the plantation yard, through the kitchen garden, and up to the side door of the main house, where Abner Gossett slept alone in a ground-floor bedroom. His wife had left him 3 years earlier and gone back to her mother's people in Tennessee. She did not speak. She did not scream. She did not, according to Roa Green, even breathe hard. What she did to Abner Gossett in the next several minutes, and with what instrument, the WPA interviewer Lemuel Krauss declined to transcribe in full. The transcript at that exact point contains only a single notation in Krauss's handwriting. Asterisk subject became distressed. Conversation paused 14 minutes, asterisk then a single resumed sentence in Roa Green's own voice. She left him where he could be found, but not where he could be helped. Hester then walked back across the yard to the corn crib, broke the iron hasp of the lock with the long iron bar Gossett himself had used earlier that day to bar the door, carried her brother out on her back because he could no longer walk or stand, and laid him gently under a pecan tree on the edge of the yard, where a woman named Delia was already waiting in the dark with a stoneware jug of sweet water and a poultice of chewed tobacco leaves and lard for the wounds on his back. Hester did not stay. She did not even kiss her brother goodbye. She took Gossett's revolver. She took Gossett's boots. She took Gossett's thoroughbred horse from the stable, and she rode north through the cane. By first light, she was in the Yazoo Swamp. By the following night, she had reached the Union Army picket line outside Vicksburg, where a young corporal in the 47th Illinois Volunteer Infantry would later write in a letter to his wife that a colored woman on a fine thoroughbred horse had come walking out of the cane at dusk with a pistol stuck in her belt and the calmest face he had ever seen in his life. The woman, the corporal wrote, had said her name was Hester, that she was 24 years old, that she was not going back, and that she would not say goodbye to her brother because she was afraid that if she did, she would not be able to leave. The corporal's letter, preserved today in the Illinois State Historical Library in Springfield, is the first document anywhere in the United States in which Hester appears as a free woman. It is also the last document anywhere in which she appears under that name. From the Vicksburg picket line, she moved north with the Union supply trains, working her passage in exchange for food and a place to sleep. By the winter of 1865, she had reached the river depot town of Cairo, Illinois, at the confluence of the Ohio and the Mississippi. There she found work as a laundress in a boarding house that catered to Union officers. And there, according to two separate references in the quartermaster records of the 13th Army Corps held today at the National Archives in Washington, she also served unpaid as a tracker and scout attached to a Union cavalry detachment under the command of a captain named Winthrop Height. Captain Height was a veteran, a graduate of Dartmouth College, a man who kept a daily diary from the outbreak of the war to his death in 1888. His diaries were recovered in 1951 from his family estate outside Brattleboro and donated to the University of Vermont. 3 diary entries, and only 3, mention Hester. In the first, dated February 11, 1865, Height writes that the colored woman H brought in 2 deserters from the 27th Missouri before sundown without assistance and without firing her weapon, asking for no payment of any kind, only a pair of Army-issue boots in her own size, which he provided from the quartermaster's stock. In the second, dated March 3, 1865, he writes a single sentence, "She can read sign the way a Methodist reads scripture." In the third and final entry, dated April 19, 1865, 5 days after Lincoln's assassination and 10 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Height writes at length. He records that H had come to him at dawn already dressed for the road with her horse saddled outside the tent and had asked to be formally released from whatever informal service she was still rendering to the army. He asked where she intended to go. She told him, in words he quotes directly in the diary, that she was going to find the man Gossett, whom she had left at Carrick the previous September, and who, she had only learned the previous week from a freedman passing through Cairo, had not in fact died of his wounds. He had been found by a Confederate field doctor on the road out of Vicksburg, nursed slowly back from the edge of death over the winter of 1864 to 65, and since the spring had joined a Confederate guerrilla band operating in the borderland between southern Arkansas and the Indian Territory under a false name. Captain Height wrote that he tried for the better part of an hour to talk her out of it. He reminded her that the war was ending, that the country was exhausted, that a colored woman riding alone into the country would have no law to protect her, no friend to bury her, no witness to speak her name. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply listened until he was finished, thanked him for the boots and the use of his horse, and walked out of his tent into the cold gray light. He never saw her again. Which brings us, by a long route, to the Indian Territory, and to the 5 years of her life between the spring of 1869 and the autumn of 1874, about which we know, all at once, the most and the least, and by a considerable margin, the most disturbing things. Between those dates, a woman answering her description appeared and reappeared in the court records of the federal court at Fort Smith, always at a distance, never directly. She never testified in open court. She never signed her name to any document. She never accepted payment in person from any federal officer. She collected her bounties entirely through an intermediary, a Choctaw freedman named Isham Folsom, who had fought in the Union Indian Home Guard during the war and who, by the late 1860s, had settled on a small farm at Scullyville, earning a quiet supplementary income as her banker and go-between with the marshals. The court clerk's ledgers show that, in those 5 years, bounty payments totaling $4,611.27 were paid out to Isham Folsom on warrants served by, in the clerk's consistent phrasing across more than 30 entries, the colored female tracker known as Nani Star. That was an enormous sum for the period, roughly the lifetime earnings of a skilled tradesman. It represented the capture or killing of at least 31 federal fugitives. She operated alone, without a partner, posse, or backup of any kind. She rode a succession of different horses, never keeping the same animal longer than a season, because she knew a horse was the first thing an outlaw would recognize on a road. She wore, according to 3 surviving eyewitness accounts of her at work, a long man's wool coat dyed black with walnut hulls to kill the shine, a wide-brimmed black felt hat pulled low against the sun, heavy broken boots, and around her neck, beneath the coat, a thin leather cord from which hung 7 small notched bone beads. No man or woman ever saw her in any account without that cord. The beads, rumor whispered among the outlaws of the territory, were one for each of the 7 men she was still looking for. She did not take the men she was not looking for, and she turned them in alive when she could, significantly more often than the men of her trade. She accepted the lower bounty rather than deliver a corpse. But when it came to one of the 7, she did not bring him in alive. She did not bring him in at all. When she found one of the 7, the body was never seen again. The horse would walk into a settlement days later. The cabin would be found undisturbed. The trail in the dirt would simply stop, and a single filed bone bead would be left somewhere at the scene, smooth and pale against the dark ground. The first of the 7 men to be crossed off her list was a Missouri guerrilla named Jubal Creech, who had ridden with Quantrill's raiders during the war and had been at the Lawrence Massacre of 1863, according to 2 sworn depositions, afterward joining the same Arkansas Indian Territory brush band as Abner Gossett. In the summer of 1865, Creech was found, or rather, was not found, in the spring of 1870 on the Pine Mountain Trail north of the Kiamishi River. His horse came walking into a Choctaw settlement 3 days later with his saddlebags still tied on, rifle still in the scabbard, a full canteen at the pommel, and a single filed bone bead wedged carefully into the stitching of the saddle, where anyone unsaddling the animal would find it. The Choctaw light horseman who examined the horse said the bead was a message, though they would not say to whom, from whom, or what it meant. The second of the 7 was a Cherokee freedman turned horse thief named W.I. Spann, who had joined Gossett's band in 1866 after the hanging of his own father for the theft of a judge's mule, and who had developed a particular reputation for violence against women. Spann disappeared in the winter of 1871 from a remote log cabin on the north branch of Black Fork Creek, between one evening and the next morning. When deputy marshals reached the cabin 4 days later, it was undisturbed in every respect, his coffee pot still on the cold stove, boots standing side by the door, pipe still lying on the table next to a dog-eared copy of the Tahlequah newspaper. On the table, placed in the exact geometric center of a square of clean white paper, was a single filed bone bead. Beneath it, written in a careful schoolroom hand that several readers have described as unusually beautiful, were the names of 3 women and 2 children. A missionary schoolteacher in Tahlequah later recognized the names as corresponding to 5 carrot plantation people, 3 adult women and 2 young children, who had been sold away from the plantation in 1861, separated from their families and never heard from again, with W.Y. Spann himself listed in the surviving bill of sale as the buyer's agent who had arranged their transport south. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th of the 7 fell in quick succession across the summer and autumn of 1872, in circumstances I will not detail here fully for reasons of length, except to note that in each case, a filed bone bead was left at the scene where the body should have been, that each man had been named in his own confession to a priest, friend, or drinking companion as having been present at the carrot plantation during a specific and documented act of cruelty committed against Hester's mother, whose name in the 1854 carrot inventory was recorded as Tempe, and that in each case, the trail of the missing men, followed by deputy marshals for days, simply ended at a riverbank, the lip of a sinkhole, or the edge of a cotton field, as if the men had walked into the ground and the ground had politely closed over him. By early spring 1873, the 2 names remaining on Hester's bone cord were Abner Gossett himself, and a man about whom I must warn you now. The surviving records are so fragmentary, so deliberately redacted, so carefully and institutionally broken, that we cannot even be certain of his real name. The court clerk whose private letters to his wife first surfaced in the spring of 1962, when his grandson opened a locked trunk in an attic in Van Buren, refers to the 7th man in a letter written in early summer 1873 as simply the men we do not speak of. He notes, in a tone of considerable unease, that the marshal's office in Fort Smith had received that June a direct instruction from Washington, delivered in person by a senior official of the Department of the Interior who had traveled down specifically for this purpose, not to issue any warrant under any name for any fugitive associated with a certain federal property in the Indian Territory. He does not name the property. He does not name the fugitive. He notes only that the instruction troubled him greatly, that he lost sleep over it for weeks, and that in his private view, the instruction had come because someone in Washington, someone high enough to send an interior official on a special train across 3 states, was afraid of what a certain colored female tracker would find if she continued riding in the direction she was already known to be riding. The court clerk's name was Thaddeus Buell. Born in Vermont, educated at a small Presbyterian college in Ohio, he had come to Fort Smith as a young man after the war. His letters to his wife, who had remained in Ohio during the first 3 years of his appointment because of ill health, are the single most important primary source on the last phase of Hester's life. They are also the source the Arkansas Historical Society, meeting twice in the autumn of 1962, voted by majority not to publish. If you're finding this story as unsettling as I am, take a moment to hit the like button below. It genuinely helps these forgotten American stories reach people who would never otherwise hear them, and it tells me specifically to keep digging into the archives for more. And if you already have a theory about who the 7th man was, or what the instruction from Washington was protecting, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me tell you what happened next, because this is where the story stops being a hunt and starts being something considerably darker, and where the records themselves begin to behave strangely, going missing, coming back, being replaced with other records that do not say the same thing. In the high summer of 1873, Hester went silent for 4 months. There are no payments to Isham Folsom in the Fort Smith ledger from the first week of June through the last week of September. No sightings of her on the Choctaw roads. No reports of her passage at any Arkansas River ferry, where ferrymen who knew her coat and had previously tracked her with some consistency. No whispered rumors at trading posts in McAllister, Atoka, or Eufaula. She simply disappeared for 4 consecutive months in the middle of her most active year. The silence ended on October 14, 1873, when a Creek Nation light horseman named Pleasant Porter, then 23 years old, later in 1899 to become principal chief of the Creek Nation, rode into Fort Smith with a sealed dispatch for the federal marshal. The dispatch reported that a white man answering the description of Abner Gossett, former overseer of the carrot plantation in Mississippi, had been found 3 days earlier in an abandoned line shack on the North Fork of the Canadian River, about 40 miles west of Eufaula. He had been found alive, bound to a wooden chair with leather straps cut from a saddle, with a square of paper pinned to the front of his shirt by a sewing needle, on which had been written in the same careful schoolroom hand only 3 words. Porter's dispatch, preserved in the Fort Smith Federal Archives, preserves those 3 words exactly as written. Not him alone. Beneath the 3 words was drawn, in the same hand, a small neat sketch of a bone bead, and the bone bead in the sketch had not been filed smooth. Abner Gossett was brought to Fort Smith under heavy guard. Tried before Judge Isaac Parker in mid-November 1873 on 6 counts of murder committed during and after the war, he was convicted on 4 and sentenced to hang. The execution took place on February 7, 1874, at 11 in the morning, on the great gallows in the courtyard of the federal jail, before a crowd estimated by the Fort Smith newspaper at roughly 800 people who had come from the country specifically to see it. In his final statement from the scaffold, recorded by a reporter for the Fort Smith Elevator and printed the following morning, Gossett did not confess, did not beg, did not pray, did not ask forgiveness of any man or any God. He said, and the reporter's shorthand notes preserve this exactly, *, she should have killed me herself, and she will never forgive herself that she did not. And the man she is still looking for is a worse man than I ever was. And you will never hang him, and you will never even write his name down, because the people who own him own you too, *. Those were the last words of Abner Gossett in this world. The hangman released the trapdoor. The crowd went home. The reporter filed his copy. And Hester, wherever she was that morning, began the final hunt of her life, the hunt that would consume the last 15 months of her work, take her across 3 states, and bring her, at the end, to something she had not expected to find, and that we ourselves, reading the records 150 years later, are forced to confront as the thing the Arkansas Historical Society could not bring itself to publish. The 7th name on Hester's cord, it turns out, was not a name at all. It was a title. And the title, in the surviving margin notes of Thaddeus Buell to his own personal copies of the court ledger, was Indian Agent. Specifically, the federal Indian agent assigned to a particular agency within the Indian Territory between 1855 and 1861, a man whose official federal duties included the distribution of annuity payments to one of the 5 tribes, the licensing of white traders doing business within that tribe's boundaries, and, most importantly for this story, the regulation of slavery within the agency's jurisdiction. This last duty existed because at that date, the 5 tribes were themselves, in the eyes of federal law, sovereign slaveholding nations, and the agent's role therefore included, among other responsibilities, the official return of runaway slaves who had crossed into the territory from the United States to their legal owners in the states east of the Arkansas River. The agency in question was a real place with real buildings, employees, and account books. It still exists today as an archaeological site on federal land, though the original buildings are long gone, with only the foundations and a single restored outbuilding remaining. The agent himself was also real. His name appears in the Department of the Interior appointment rolls for 1855, and in the department's termination rolls for 1861, when he resigned for reasons described at the time as personal. I have chosen, after consulting with a living descendant of one of the families involved, not to put his full name into this video, because there are still people alive today who bear his name and his blood and who have had no part whatsoever in the things I am about to describe. What matters for the story is not his name. What matters is what he did. According to the reconstruction assembled in the autumn of 1962 by an amateur historian named Silas Fry, a retired schoolteacher from Fort Smith who had spent the better part of 3 years reading Thaddeus Buell's letters and cross-referencing them with federal records and plantation purchase ledgers, the agent had, between 1855 and 1861, run a private business on the side of his federal position. He used his official powers to identify runaway slaves from the southern states who had managed to reach the Indian Territory. He captured those runaways with the help of 4 or 5 hired men within the boundaries of his own agency. And he sold them, not back to their original owners, which would have required paperwork and attracted notice, but to entirely new slaveholders in Texas and Arkansas, pocketing a substantial personal profit that he never recorded in any official ledger. The business was illegal under both federal and tribal law. But because of the geography of the territory and the almost complete absence of federal oversight of agency activity, it was effectively invisible to anyone outside the 4 or 5 men personally involved. Silas Fry, working slowly through 13 boxes of agency records transferred to the Federal Archives in 1861 and never examined by any historian in the intervening century, identified by name at least 34 individuals taken through the agent's private pipeline in those 6 years. 29 of the 34 names were fully recoverable. One of the 29 names, on a bill of sale dated November 17, 1854, was Tempe. That was the same Tempe who appeared in the Carrick Plantation inventory of January 1855 as a recent purchase from an Indian agency in the Creek Nation for $450, listed by age, approximate height, and the birthmark on her left shoulder. That was the same Tempe who gave birth 9 months later to a girl named Hester. And that was the same Tempe who died at Carrick in the late spring of 1858 under circumstances the plantation officially recorded as fever, but that the WPA narratives, collected 79 years later from 3 separate witnesses, describe in terms no serious historian has ever treated as fever. Hester had not known. This is the piece of the story that strikes hardest, the piece hardest to write about calmly. The records we have, fragmentary as they are, suggest strongly that Hester had believed, from her earliest childhood memory on the plantation until the late summer of 1873, when she was already 33, that her mother had been born at Carrick, had lived her whole life there, had died there, and had never seen any other piece of ground in the world. What Hester learned in the late summer of 1873, and what caused her to go silent for those 4 unaccounted months, was that her mother had once, for a very brief period, been free. She had been born into slavery on a cotton plantation in Monroe County, Alabama, in 1834. She escaped at 19 in early spring 1853, walking west for 41 nights across Mississippi, Louisiana, and the eastern edge of Texas. She made it to the Creek Nation in late summer of that year. She was alive, free, and safe in the Indian Territory for 10 full months. And then, in early autumn 1854, a federal Indian agent hunted her down inside a Creek freedman's cabin where she had been taking shelter, put her in a wagon at gunpoint with 3 other captured runaways, drove the wagon 180 miles to a plantation landing on the Yazoo River, and sold her to Thomas Carrick for $450 in gold coin. 9 months later, she gave birth at Carrick to a daughter she named, in a moment no one on the plantation understood at the time, Hester, which in some old traditions is a name given to children who are hoped for, waited for, and carried a long way before they arrive. For years after that, in the spring of 1858, she was dead. The man who sold her was, in the late summer of 1873, still alive. He was living comfortably on a federal pension under his own name in a small town in eastern Arkansas, under the explicit protection of the instruction from Washington that Thaddeus Buell had noted with such unease in his letter to his wife. And Hester, having at last learned his name from sources the records do not preserve, rode east out of the Indian Territory toward that small town in Arkansas to find him. She found him in December. We know this because Dr. Josiah Alden, a physician in Fort Smith, recorded in his professional casebook, bound in black cloth and surviving in the special collections of the University of Arkansas Library, that on December 17 he had been summoned at 2 in the afternoon to a boarding house on the Van Buren Road, about 6 miles from the edge of town, to attend a white man suffering from what the doctor described as a gunshot wound of the lower abdomen, inflicted at very close range with a large caliber weapon. The wound, in the doctor's professional opinion, was consistent with a Remington Army revolver fired at a distance of less than 6 feet. The doctor also described, in the same casebook entry, a second wound on the same patient, which he declined to describe in any detail, writing only that it was a ritual mutilation of a character so distressing and so deliberate in its execution that he would not commit it to writing in any casebook that might be read by another physician or by a family member of the deceased at a later date. The men died on December 19, 1874, at approximately 4 in the morning, after 2 days of what the doctor recorded as the most protracted and horrible suffering he had ever witnessed in 28 years of frontier practice in a dying human being. The doctor's casebook throughout the entire entry does not record the man's name, because, as the doctor notes at the end in a line apparently added later, a sheriff's deputy who arrived at the boarding house late on December 18th had instructed him directly not to record the name under any circumstances, and had later returned, in the hour after the death, to take official possession of the body. The boarding house register for that week, recovered in the 1940s from the attic of a building being demolished for a gas station, contained no entry for the room the doctor described. The page had been torn out clean along the binding. What the doctor did record, in a margin note on the same page of his casebook, written, from the different ink color and slight change in handwriting, some weeks after the rest of the entry, was that on the small pine table beside the dying man's bed, on the second morning while the man was still barely conscious, the doctor had seen a single small filed bone bead, smooth as river-washed ivory. Beside it lay a small square of clean white paper, and on that paper, written in a careful schoolroom hand, was a single word, Tempe. Just that one word and nothing else. And Dr. Josiah Alden had known, without being told, in a way he could not later explain to himself, that he was looking at the end of something that had started long before he arrived at that boarding house, and that had traveled a great distance, and that had, on that cold December morning in a rented room in eastern Arkansas, at last come home. He did not know the beginning. We do. Hester was not arrested. No warrant was ever sworn by any sheriff, marshal, or federal officer for the death of the men on the Van Buren Road, because the men on the Van Buren Road officially had not died. Officially, he had not been there. Officially, according to the Washington instruction, he had not existed in the Indian Territory or in Arkansas in any capacity since the day of his resignation in 1861. The instruction had done its work. His pension continued to be paid out for another 16 years to a post office box in a different town in a different state, apparently collected by someone. But Hester did not go back to the Indian Territory. She did not return to Isham Folsom on his small farm at Scullyville. She did not collect another bounty from the Fort Smith court. She did not, as far as any surviving record indicates, ever fire a weapon at any person for the remainder of her life. What she did do, according to the last document that mentions her by any name, was buy a piece of land. The land was 80 acres of cut-over timber country in a shallow valley in the hill country of western Arkansas, about 30 miles northwest of Fort Smith and 12 miles from the nearest town. The deed was recorded in the county deed book on March 11, 1875, under the name Hester Alden, the surname apparently borrowed, with his permission, from the doctor who had treated her mother's killer, and who seems, from a single surviving letter in the Alden family papers, to have become in the last weeks of 1874 and the first of 1875 her unlikely friend. She paid $160 cash for the 80 acres. She built, with her own hands and the occasional help of 2 black carpenters from the nearest town, a small 2-room frame house with a stone chimney and a good well. She planted an orchard of Arkansas black apple trees. She kept bees, 9 hives by 1878, and sold the honey in jars at the Saturday market in the nearest town. She is recorded in the 1880 federal census of that county as a widow, black, approximately 40 years old, occupation farmer, living alone, unable to read or write, which was not true, but was what she told the census taker. After 188,